Okay, so this is really just a continuation of the last episode because I got cut off because my speaker went dead in in episode 8. So this is episode 8.5. All I'm really doing is rereading where the sound cut out, which is at 62. So we're going to read from 62. There never comes the decisive gesture of Marx of renouncing knowledge to suspend it back into being. Substance is the conceit of a knowledge that already inheres in being, perfectly continuous with the intellect, which at no point runs upon the limit of its pretensions. So what he's saying is that what Marx did is he renounced the idea that he knows anything in any absolute way. So both uh, Descartes and Spinoza claim to know at least one thing absolutely. With Descartes, he claims to absolutely know about the existence of the subject, and then he has a method to try to know in an absolute and an exact way what he calls a distinct, uh, a clear and distinct way things about objective reality. Whereas, and so for him, the subject was fundamental because it's what he knows for sure. And for Spinoza, he claims to know about the existence of the material reality for sure, and about these monads being the fundamental substance of the world, right? So they both claim to have a kind of absolute knowledge. They never suspend it back into being, where you say, okay, well, I have the way that I experience reality, right? Um, but whatever is, but that experience is what's fundamental to me because it's what I experience. But that's entirely dependent on both myself and the fundamental and the objective reality, not one or the other. And I can't claim to know with absoluteness about either one, and so I have to be pragmatic, right? Both Descartes and Spinoza fail to do that. They believe that being, as he puts it, is perfectly continuous with the intellect. So, in other words, everything I think to know, I think I know about reality is what reality is, right? It's this conceit, right? In practice, it becomes a type of ideological hubris, asserting the unreality and meaninglessness of every actually substantive bond of civilization in favor of a supreme substance that has neither any skin of its own in the game nor any reality outside of a calcified intellect. So, as I mentioned, it's a kind of conceit, right? It's an ideological conceit. And the reason that it asserts the unreality and meaninglessness of every actually substantive bond of civilization is because everything about civilization and material reality and subjective reality has to, in some way, reduce to what they're talking about. Because if it doesn't, it invalidates their axioms, right? That's what he means by being ideological. That's what he means by being metaphysical as opposed to ontological, right? When you're talking about ontology, you're talking about things as they are. When you're talking about metaphysical, you're talking about principles that govern the physical, right? So if you claim to be able to speak in absolute terms about principles that govern the physical, that's a particular intellectual orientation. In my view, that's a useful orientation for certain things. For example, if you want to do scientific endeavor, you need to have a more or less, and by scientific, I mean scientific in the modern sense, where you're really trying to get clear and distinct ideas about things. If you want to do that, you really do have to use the Cartesian method. But to then take what you find in the Cartesian method and then try to universalize it, it's invalid. You're using the wrong tool for the job, right? If you're trying to generalize, you do have to, as Haas puts it, suspend knowledge into being, right? More importantly, it renders scientific socialism into a metaphysical dogma, incapable of deriving concrete knowledge of concrete social reality. No specificity of societal objectivity is possible. Everything is just capitalism permeating the whole of its attributes. Mhm. So what I believe Haas is doing here is he's saying, and I haven't I haven't read this author that he's talking about. I mean, I've read Spinoza. I've read a little bit of Spinoza. I've read Descartes' main works. Um, so I'm taking Haas's word for it. But what Haas is saying that he's saying, I think it's Plekhanov. Is that who it is? Yeah, Plekhanov. Okay. So what he's saying is where for Spinoza the fundamental thing is the monad, right? Which is kind of like an atom, right? For Plekhanov, the fundamental thing is capitalism. So it's this idea that everything in society basically reduces to this idea about capitalism. So he's taking sort of this Spinozist method and substituting the fundamental substance with capitalism. I think that's what he's saying. That's my interpretation based on what I'm reading. It is obvious that if everything is objective, then nothing in particular is, including society itself. The extent of society's objectivity is the extent it is continuous with the dogma of the mind. It is no wonder Spinoza is the favorite thinker of pseudo Marxist academia. Right. Because if everything's objective, so in other words, because Spinoza believes that all subjective things arise out of the objective things, right, and in this sort of continuous sort of way, in this Newtonian sort of way, this mechanical sort of way, and then you have to reduce all these relationships that people have with each other with material reality to this kind of mechanical process, then you really can't differentiate in any meaningful way between what's objective and what's subjective, right? Because then you're saying that the subjective is the objective, right? In other words, you're basically annihilating the concept of the subjective period. And again, that's basically the premise that the behaviorists worked with. And there's some validity to it because we are influenced, right, by brain chemistry. We are influenced by things in our environment. But to say that man's soul and civilization reduces to that is absurd. And at the very least, it's not useful, right? I mean, what do you do with that if it's true? It's just determinism at that point. Spinozism is categorically incompatible with Marxism for no other reason than that its foundations make impossible insight into laws governing historical development and the particular qualitative character of societies. It could not possibly constitute any class consciousness. I think we already covered this. But yeah, basically that's right. Um, if you abrogate man's free will and you just say that it's all uh, deterministic and mechanical, then there is no historical development. There's just atrophy, and there's just what's the word I'm looking for? Entropy. That's the word I was looking for. There's just entropy, right? And it just doesn't make sense to talk about a class consciousness in that sense, because it doesn't really make sense to talk about consciousness in that, if that's the case, right? Because if you're saying consciousness, what that means to most people is, oh, well, you have someone who thinks for themselves and makes decisions. But what Spinoza is saying is that this idea that people make decisions is just it's ephemera. It's it's um, it's an emulation. It's not really it's not really free in any actual sense, right? Specifically, it cannot afford any recognition of the objectivity of contradictions such as the class struggle. Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Because here's the thing: if you're saying that everything reduces to this objective material and everything is deterministic and mechanical, then the idea of there being a contradiction of any kind is kind of nonsensical, right? Because that's like saying there's a contradiction in physical laws. That doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot more sense to say there's contradictions if you're dealing with tensions within society that have to do with competing interests and competing desires, right? But for those to make sense, you can't be speaking in terms of determinism. Or if you do, it really reduces the meaningfulness of that. In the stead of the objectivity of class struggle lies a pure subjectivist will to eminence, a notion of communism as antisocial as Lukácsian self-consciousness. Will to eminence. Interesting. I don't know what that means. I'm going to look into that. Okay. Interesting. So it's an inversion of this concept of immanent will. Okay. So immanent will is a philosophical concept that describes a force that determines the fates of people. So a will to immanence is the will to be the immanent will, right? So it's the will to be able to determine the fates of people. That's interesting. And that makes sense. That makes sense. Right? So what he's saying is instead of dealing with the class struggle as an objective reality, they want to deal with it as a phenomenon that they can then manipulate in order to control society, if I understand that correctly. Which is what they're doing. That is what they're doing. And these people are not ignorant of the Hegelian dialectic or the material dialectic, but they use it for their own ends. And this is, you could say this is perhaps how they justify it. It makes sense. The scholastic concept substance does not resolve the object-subject distinction, which is the principal theoretical problem of Western Marxism, but only conceals it. For the 100 plus years Western Marxism has existed, for the 100 plus years of Western Marxism has confused it with Marxist materialism. Marxism was condemned to metaphysically languish. There's some typos here. I'm trying to make sense of it with the typos. Okay, so he's saying that for the last 100 years, Western Marxism has confused this scholastic concept of substance with Marxist materialism, because Marx isn't talking about materialism in terms of this sort of monistic determinism. When he talks about materialism, he's talking about what are the experienced material realities. That's a very different concept, and that's what he's saying. So Marx is talking about the material reality as it's experienced by a people, and then the Western Marxists are taking that to mean uh, determinism based on monism. It suffices only to recall Marx's own apt view of Spinoza, a metaphysically disguised objectivity, which excludes the objectivity of man, and therefore the socius relevant for Marxism and materialism. Right, because there's no way that a man can be objective and deterministic, right? Because then you're talking about someone who has cognitive capacity in reality, not the appearance of cognitive capacity based on Newtonian clockwork, right? Let's read what Marx wrote about it. The dispute between Strauss and Bauer over substance and self-consciousness is a dispute within Hegelian speculation. In Hegel, there are three elements: Spinoza's substance, Fichte's self-consciousness, and Hegel's necessarily antagonistic unity of the two, the absolute spirit. Okay. The first element is metaphysically disguised nature separated from man. The second is metaphysically disguised spirit separated from nature. The third is the metaphysically disguised unity of both real man and the real human species. Right. So this is Marx reaching towards Dasein right here. The metaphysically disguised unity of man and nature. Right? Very interesting. Gonna have to end it there for today. We will pick it up there tomorrow.